So then coming up then October 3rd, we're going to be hearing from Brian Barrett and Walt Hebern at Fresno State. They've been doing some really interesting pilot work around kind of studying the time it takes to remediate certain kinds of content items, really tracking how their institution kind of scale up from their pilot to support a broader inclusive learning culture. They're really pushing the idea of a culture shift in Ally as trying to help catalyze a kind of culture shift to a more inclusive learning environment. So they did a really detailed pilot study and are very active in the research process. So I think that will be a really exciting one for those of you that are really in early stages and trying to think about, hey, how would we best structure a pilot in a supportive way and in a way that we can really understand and start to chart some of our progress. Then coming up after that, the following week, October 10th, we have a really awesome team from UC Berkeley. It's going to be talking about 5 dimensions of inclusive classroom. This is going to cover things from accessibility of content, as well as thinking about accessibility, really interesting tools for STEM content and some things that are happening in that area, but then also broadening that conversation to thinking about kind of cultural inclusivity and designing activities and learning experiences that really kind of connect across the various kinds of needs and abilities that students bring with them into the classroom. So they're also just starting a pilot. They're in very early stages of Ally, and that should be an exciting conversation. And then the 24th and the 31st, we're bringing together 2 awesome panels to talk about both accessibility as well as to talk about Ally rollout strategies. So the accessibility pro tips panel and Krista Gear, who's on the call, will be on there. This is a really great group of accessibility thought leaders. I think they'll bring a lot of interesting conversation to the panel. And then the following week, we have a number of directors who have been kind of leading the charge on their campus in their Ally rollouts. So you'll get a really good sense of the various kinds of activities and strategies that they have used. Christopher Soren from Tacoma Community College will be on that panel. We recently did a case study with him where they talked about gamifying their accessibility initiative. You can find that in the community site here, and I'll point to that. Eric Kunin from GVSU, so he'll be on there, as well as Kim Gelsinger and Dina Kutz. So very exciting panel there. And then we're going to wrap things up. November 14th, we'll be at the Accessing Higher Ground conference, as well as there'll be a group at the OLC Accelerate conference too. So we'll try to coordinate some events potentially at those conferences to connect to the group. Other things related to the Ally community site, in case you're unaware, the blog and case study space here is a place that you can access some of the case studies that we've been developing. Our most recent one is from the Georgia Technical College System of Georgia. They rolled out Ally to 22 colleges. Talks a little bit about some of the strategies that the colleges use there to increase their accessibility scores. They've seen some really remarkable progress from some of the colleges that have really taken a proactive role, and their big strategy there is really to it's an iterative process. You can't fix all the issues overnight, so they talk a little bit through how they approach the challenges of this mountain of accessibility issues that surfaced in their institutional reports, how they leverage that information to make strategic decisions. You can also find the Tacoma case study, Chico State. So if you're looking for comps to universities or campuses that are similar to yours, you can find some of those stories here in the blog and case study space. The discussion space you all are probably familiar with. That's a place to post questions and receive responses to your questions. The release notes section, this is a really key place where you can follow all the updates from Nicholas on the product side. Each release is included here with detailed notes. as well as screenshots, so you can stay up to date. As you know, part of Ally's agile process is that we're constantly gathering user feedback and input and implementing those changes in Ally and releasing those on a pretty steady release cycle. Nicholas, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how you do the release notes, or touch on that a bit.
Yes, so very briefly, so basically the release notes are made available in a number of different places. So the user group is one of those places. We also have them as part of our help and documentation website, which maybe John, you can very quickly bring up on the screen as well. So that's where we have all of our user-facing documentation. So there's documentation there for the institutional report. There's documentation there for the instructor feedback, and there's documentation there for the alternative formats. This is also where the adoption and communication toolkit lives, and so we also post our release notes to the help and documentation website. And then the last place where you can find them, and this is more specifically for those of you that are using Blackboard Learn as your LMS. We also post them to behind the Blackboard, where all of the other Blackboard release notes are made available. So just a general note. So basically, whenever we roll out a new release, we'll post the release notes to all of those places. As soon as a new release goes out, you will automatically have access to the features and the improvements that are included in that release. So that happens automatically. If there is a case where a feature is opt-in or opt-out, then we will explicitly mention that within the release notes. If there is something within the release that requires specific functionality within the learning management system itself. So for example, very recently we released the ability for us to check WYSIWYG content created within the content editor within the learning management system, check that for accessibility issues and include that in the institutional report. So that was one example of where, in order to be able to use those features, you had to be on a specific version of either Learn or Moodle. And so if there's any of those, then again that will be an explicit part of the release notes. And if there's any feedback around how those release notes can be more useful, do definitely let us know.
Thanks, Nicholas. And you can see on the help site here, we break it down with the 3 different user groups that Ally touches. So for the student here, you'll be able to get really nice detailed information about the different alternative formats and the benefits of each of those formats, as well as where you can find the formats in different LMSs. So the questions around electronic Braille here, we can see a little bit of information about what the electronic Braille format is, why it can be beneficial. It has a link to an article here about the benefits of the Braille. It is something that we actually talk a lot about. How can we figure out kind of how to demo the Braille piece of it? It's obviously by nature not especially visual, so it can be a little bit challenging to represent it. But this does give you a bit of information there about that electronic Braille format. You can also see recommenders, readers for the EPUB version. And so, we have found that in general, it's really important that the messaging for students, making sure that they're aware of the availability of those formats, as well as choosing a format that's going to fit their need and fit their purpose. There may be questions popping up. I hear little pings. Nicholas, if you can moderate that for me so I don't have to navigate out of the screen share, and just let me know if there's questions that we need to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually, some of those pings were mine, and I was wondering if Krista maybe would be able to say a little bit more about the electronic Braille format and how, given her experience at the University of Washington, and what the best way may be to demo that particular format.
Yeah, great question. Is it now a good time to chime in?
Absolutely, go for it.
Okay, great.
It's always a good time.
Perfect. Great, so just so everybody knows my background, I spent the last 6 years at the University of Washington as their assistant director over accessible technology and content remediation. And so I would work directly with students who were blind, low vision, had learning disabilities, had traumatic brain injuries and such, and getting their content into a format that they could use. And part of that was working with students who were blind who did use electronic Braille, or the RBF format, Refreshable Braille format. So if you're brand new to accessibility, or if it's been a while, one of the ways that someone who is blind can interact with a computer or a website or other electronic means is through a refreshable Braille display. So it kind of looks like your keyboard, but it's a keyboard for someone who's blind. It's also like a keyboard, not a keyboard, a computer for someone who's blind. So while it looks just like a keyboard, it is connected to the internet. Somebody who's blind can navigate, check their email, create documents, and so on. The really cool thing about the refreshable Braille machine is it creates Braille on the fly, meaning it's looking at the files or it's looking at the electronic content and it's translating it into Braille. And so you'll see a part of the keyboard, it has little dots that pop up and down based on what the word is, what the sentence is, what the punctuation is, and so on. And so one of the formats that Ally produces is the electronic Braille format, the BRF file. I think I flipped that earlier, but the BRF file, and that is just a way for someone who is blind to use it on a particular device, which is the refreshable Braille display. The best way to demo that, though, honestly, is to have a blind individual watch a blind individual interact with their refreshable Braille display. And I am happy to find a couple of videos that I've referred to in the past of somebody demoing how that works. I actually had a prior blind employee create a video for me that I can find. So if you're trying to demonstrate it to others on your campus, if you don't have access to somebody on campus who uses one of those machines and can demo that file type, then probably the next best thing is to show them a video. So hopefully that helps somewhat. I know it's not the best answer, but I'm happy to find some resources, and hopefully I can find them before our time ends today. But if I don't, John and Nicholas, what would be the best way to share that with the group? Just put it in the Ally user group?
Yeah, I think that would be fantastic. We could, if we could link to a resource there in the discussion space, I think that would be fantastic.
Okay, perfect. So I will work on making a post then.
No, that's great, and it may also be interesting to actually add one of those videos to the help and documentation page that's currently on the screen, so that we can distribute that a little bit more widely.
Okay, awesome. I'll do that then. Thanks.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Any other outstanding questions out there or anything? I'll also I'll show here in the administrator panel, you can access the adoption toolkit, and here you can find a number of resources. So you can download the full package for your LMS. You can see the contents of what's in that package. So these are all one-pagers. They're accessible PDFs. And you can, again, these are Creative Commons licensed. They are free for you to remix and reuse and repurpose as you see fit. So you have some kind of high-level general overviews around what Ally is doing. And then you also have access to these micro-learning documents. So these are one-pagers that are really kind of focused around how Ally uses the instructor feedback to walk through step by step how to correct a particular issue. So this is kind of pulling out a very small snippet of what's in the instructor feedback and just laying it out here in a one-pager. You could use these in developing course modules. You could distribute them. We saw a really interesting example. One of the colleges, as part of their Ally initiative, they actually had a kind of a weekly campaign around a particular accessibility issue. So one week it might have been adding alternative descriptions to the images. Another would have been focused on document headings. And that was a really effective way for them to allow instructors to, kind of peel off one piece at a time, focus their energy and attention and learning around one issue, not feel overwhelmed that they had to do everything at one time. So that kind of a campaign, that kind of strategy is something that we have seen that was really beneficial for some of the colleges. In the process of remixing things, if you need to access a screenshot library, we don't want you to have to reproduce and go through and do all your own screenshots, so you can access screenshots here. We also have some sample surveys, and so here you have we've created 3 surveys. Again, opportunity for you to remix these and modify them as you see fit, but there's 2 instructor surveys. One that is a accessibility awareness survey, really designed to kind of get a baseline sense of how your instructors are thinking about accessibility issues and what their current practices are. And then there's a kind of a post-ALLI survey where you can try to get a sense of how those behaviors and understandings may be shifting over time, as well as maybe what kinds of successes and challenges they may be having in leveraging the instructor feedback. And then with the student surveys, here's get a sense of how students are using the alternative formats, how they're thinking about their own learning. So we always try to infuse into this documentation universal design for learning principles, and really kind of thinking about how are students leveraging the availability of those alternative formats for devising different kinds of learning or comprehension strategies, thinking about things in UDL like executive functioning or metacognitive skills. So that's all available to you here in the Adoption Toolkit page. We're at 10:30 now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If you have any questions or anything, I'll be happy to answer them now, and then we'll kind of start to transition a little bit into our conversation about the research aspect of ALLI. But before we do that, anybody from the open office hours have any questions or anything that you'd like answered before we move on? Okay. Well, we've had a number of folks join in on the call here for the research portion of it. Very exciting to see this. I see we have some great minds from the community that have joined in on the call here to talk a little bit about research and aspects of research. Thanks, Brett. We're very happy to have you on the call. Brett Christie from California State University System, who also has done some amazing work around UDL. I'm just looking down the list here of folks. Chris Alden, do you want to introduce yourself from the Blackboard team?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everybody. I think I've spoken or met some of you in person, but my name is Chris Alden. I am the product marketing manager for ALLI, so I work closely with John and Nicholas. It's good to be here.
Thanks, Chris. And maybe we will take a couple minutes here just to have some more introductions. I see Christopher Phillips is on the call, and Chris, I was just pumping up your webinar for next week. Maybe if you want to introduce yourself very quickly.
Thanks, John. Christopher Phillips at Utah State, where I'm the accessibility coordinator and helping manage our ALLI rollout. Excited to be here today.
Thanks. And we also have Christopher Soren from Tacoma Community College, whose case study I was just referencing. Christopher, want to just introduce yourself?
Sure thing. I'm the Director of Relearning at Tacoma Community College.
Thanks, Chris. And we have the Fresno State team, who is, as I mentioned, is also been doing some really interesting thinking about research and piloting. So welcome to the Fresno State team. If you all want to just say hello.
Happy to be here. It's Brian Barrett and Walt Hebron.
Thanks, Brian. Then we have Kelvin Bentley on the call. Kelvin was really a mover in kind of organizing or helping to organize the research meeting here. Kelvin, if you want to introduce yourself.
This is Kelvin Bentley from the University of West Florida. In my role, I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Digital Learning Innovation. Excited to learn more about how we can leverage Ally to help our students.
Thanks, Calvin. And Maureen from, is that San Diego State University?
It is San Diego State University, and I oversee the assessment, research, and communications here at Instructional Technology Services. I work with John Rizzo, who's heading up our Ally pilot.
Wonderful, thank you. Anybody I missed as far as introductions? How about Mark? Mark Montesser?
Yeah, Mark Montesser from Cal State Fullerton. I'm the ATI coordinator, or the accessibility coordinator here at Cal State Fullerton, and we're just implementing Ally now. This is probably, I mean, the second week of our pilot, so we don't have any data to show, but I was just interested in listening in what you guys are talking about.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we have, is it Abby?
Yes, hi, and introduce myself. I'm Abby James. I'm listening in from the UK. I'm an accessibility researcher interested in alternative formats. I've done some work in the area. I currently work with the University of Southampton as a researcher, but work across all the universities in the UK supporting them. So really interested to see how Ally is working and supporting your research efforts.
Wonderful, thank you for joining. And we also have David Dixon on the call. He is the official Ally Community Forum Series social chair. He's very active on Twitter. If you want to introduce yourself, David.
Hello everyone, I'm David C. Dixon. I'm in my office at Southeast Kentucky Community and Technical College, located in Cumberland, Kentucky. I serve as an adjunct faculty member, Blackboard guru, and project team leader here.
Thank you, David. And Gayleen?
Hello everyone, my name is Gayleen Nguyen, and I am an LMS administrator for Cali College.
Wonderful, thank you. And then it looks like Ken Cooper just joined on the call. Ken, how's it going? Want to introduce yourself?
Great, John. Yeah, I'm LMS administrator here at Los Rios Community College District in Sacramento, California. So we have 4 campuses, and we just adopted Ally. We're still in the process of rolling it out right now. Should have full adoption in all of our courses in the spring and January.
Awesome, thanks. And I got a chance to present with Ken one time, so he's doing great work at Los Rios. And so to kick off the research call, we opened up yes, we are, California is well represented on the call. Very cool to see. I'm going to, we opened up a research Google document just to start to brainstorm some ideas and things like that. And this morning I added in some ideas around potential research areas based on some of the questions that I was seeing. And thank you, Nicholas. So I'm going to go in and share my screen and walk through a little bit of the things that you know, we've been working on as far as potential areas for research. I really tried to build this off of some of the questions that I saw that you all were posting in there, as well as conversations I've had with folks. And so I'm going to walk through a little bit about kind of the data that we're collecting on the Ally side, as well as other ways that we can think about leveraging your resources on campuses or your access there to get a more fine-grained look into how we can start to see the impact of Ally on campuses. Feel free to drop questions or comments into the chat or interrupt me as well. It's no problem. I'll ask Nicholas to moderate questions on the chat since I won't be able to see them. But again, feel free to interrupt at any moment. The idea here is just to start to develop the conversation, see some possible areas for exploration, and kind of see what would work for starting to assemble this group of researchers. Okay, and it looks like I am in. Just going to scroll up to the top here. And so first, just thinking about kind of two primary areas for research, really based on again the kind of the Ally tool. We have the instructor feedback usage and the alternative formats usage, and we can look at that across institutions, within a single institution, or within a single course. And so here's a table that just kind of maps out, just some of the main events that we're tracking in terms of that usage. And you can almost think of these as a kind of a funnel. And so with the alternative formats usage, from the moment the student engages with that alternative format, when they open up the modal, we're tracking there. What's the original file type that's being opened up, the timestamp, the institution, and the course. Now, I mentioned the metadata here because it's important to note that we are not collecting on the Ally side any student identifiers or information. So when a student triggers this, we don't know who that student is in the course, and that's purposeful for privacy protections, and it's important to us. At the same time, some of the questions around student outcomes, we have to be mindful of the data that we have available as we start to think about some of those questions. And so that flow from engaging an alternative format to beginning the download to completing the download, or if that flow gets interrupted at some point, if they cancel the download, we can have a strong sense about how are students accessing and using those alternative formats. On the instructor feedback events, we're capturing when the instructor...
John, before you go into the instructor feedback, so on the student side of things, in terms of one of the things that we are able to do is we are able to essentially track a student across all of the different things that they do within a particular course. So we know when the same student is accessing different alternative formats, but we don't actually know who that student is. So we can track them. We can kind of collect data about the different things they do, but we don't know who it is.
Yeah, and that I'm glad you mentioned that. I think that's an important distinction. So we would be able to see, if the same student is using, different content types. So that offers some interesting opportunities. And then with the instructor feedback events, again, I think this is a really critical kind of funnel to think about, from engaging the instructor feedback to then actually making a correction or altering that content type. So being able to track those score increases, being able to see that conversion rate between how often they engage the feedback and how often do they make a fix. Thinking about even the time in between that launch to making a fix. And so this can be I think a really interesting way to really see how instructors are leveraging that feedback, how that may be mapping back to workshops or professional development that you've been offering. So that's really kind of at a very high level look at some of the ways that we're capturing data on our side. And again, at the institutional level, we are always happy to provide this data back to you in a report. It is something that we are looking at including at some point in your institutional reporting. But right now, you can make a request for this data, and we can provide that for you. And so, with keeping this in mind. And again, we're looking here at usage data. This is, LMS kind of usage data. And so, it's quantitative in nature. And so building into this, from this kind of high level and then getting down and thinking about the context and specifically how this can map out to various outcomes and things like that is what we start to explore a little bit in some of these potential areas for research. And I'm not going to read through all of this stuff right now. It's a little bit dense in some parts, but the idea here is for you all to kind of see, what would be an interesting potential area to take on, what interests you specifically, how can we kind of leverage what others are gathering on their campus and pulling that into the community to potentially aggregate some findings and looking across institutions. Again, I think from a research perspective, we have such a unique opportunity as a community to really make some impactful and meaningful contributions to how people are thinking about accessibility and inclusive design at the course content level. And so the first area, and
just before you go into those areas, there's been a few additional questions in the chat that I just wanted to quickly quickly pick up on. So the first one from Maureen is so basically just confirming what you're saying. So indeed, what we have in terms of data is consistent key identifiers that are consistent for a student as they take different actions within the LMS, but we don't actually map them to the actual student identity. So that's just wanted to confirm that that's correct. And then there's also a question from Calvin on could we give a student the option to opt out instead of not being able to see who is using the alternative formats. So that is a really tricky one, especially from a GDPR point of view. And I'm actually not a GDPR expert myself, although I've been in lots of GDPR conversations. And the opt-out feature is really difficult unless we can show that it's part of it's essentially part of a key it's part of the key functionality for the application to be able to work. And I think in this case that's probably debatable. I think the only thing that could potentially work here is an opt-in scenario, but we all know that that an opt-in scenario would probably not give us the data that we're looking for. So that's a really tricky one. I'm happy to raise that again with our data privacy team, but I am fairly confident that there will be some objections to that.
Hi everyone. So the reason why I asked about it, we at UWF we're going through the GDPR process as well, and so just like everyone else, and one of the things that I have to fill out is just indicating that there is sensitive student data, within the LMS. We're using Canvas, but I still have to tell them, like, regardless of whether we were using Ally, we still have to, indicate that we have access to, sensitive student information, right? Like names, emails. We're still tracking from time to time student information, especially in those cases where maybe a student has a grade appeal, and so we have to kind of dig a little bit deeper to find out that they submit their assignment in the ways in which they say they did on a particular date. So we're already given that we have access to the LMS, I guess my argument was, well, can't we, just like we can track reports on students for what they do in the LMS, why not apply that to Ally? And even with GDPR, we can just state that, we, from time to time, we will have access to sensitive information, but we will, do what we can to make sure that it's kept private. So that's my thinking on it anyway.
And that actually makes a lot of sense, and that may be one way of sort of getting around this potential problem, that we may be able to make it an opt-in at the institutional level, so that if you as an institution say that students have been sort of given sufficient information around the fact that we will be tracking this as part of them using the LMS, then maybe we could actually start tracking some of that data for the individual institutions that sort of confirm that is the case. So that may be one way around it. Another thing that I wanted to raise was that as part of our roadmap, one of the things that we're planning to deliver is essentially both an XAPI as well as a IMS caliper feed that you as an institution will be able to sign up to, which will essentially, and sort of the basic idea being that this is something that you could potentially use for things like storing data within your data warehouse, institutional data warehouse, or sort of doing on-the-fly algorithmic decisions or something along those lines.
Thank you.
Not sure. Okay. So I'll walk through then, and again, feel free to interrupt at any time with questions, but I'll outline some of these areas, potential areas for study, and these do kind of bleed into each other, or they could be used in coordination with each other. And so starting off, at the very high level, this bird's eye view into the kind of content types and the accessibility. So this is, essentially kind of what you're getting in your institutional report. And we can kind of aggregate this and look at this across institutions, and actually we have done that, and that resource is linked above in the resources section in this document. But Ally conducted an accessibility review of around 20 million content items. And so those were reviewed for the content breakdown, which I think is a really interesting area. I think that when we're considering kind of UDL and how to diversify the kinds of engagement that students have in a classroom or in a course experience, thinking about the media content that makes up a course. Is it all PDFs and PowerPoints, or are there other kinds of media that are introduced into that context? I think it can be a really interesting opportunity to, just start to build some descriptive statistics around the accessibility of content, what kind of content faces the most challenges, what kinds of content makeups, are available inside of an institution. And then this opportunity to start to drill down and think about the course, and how can we maybe start to look at the composition of a course and the accessibility of a course as a way to start to broadly understand how that informs the student experience there. So an interesting example of this type of research was done at Blackboard, where they looked at LMS usage, and they used, the different ways that a course was designed to cluster these different kinds of course archetypes. So a more discussion-based course versus a more assessment-based course. And so visualizing and potentially kind of clustering courses based on how accessible they are, or how diverse are they in the kind of content that's available to students, would start to be an interesting way to really get a more fine-grained sense of, okay, we started at a very high level, now what does that look like at a course level? Another interesting thing that you could potentially do here at an institutional level is what we typically call kind of feature coding. So, Ally is pulling a course ID, but that course ID may not have a lot of information that might be necessary to further kind of understand what that course is. So at an institutional level, being able to add some of these features to a course, such as like what discipline is the course in, so is it a STEM course, is it an art course, because we can already imagine, right, that accessibility challenges may be quite different from one discipline to another. So starting to think about how do we kind of cluster like types of courses as a way to identify those archetypes and explore relationships. Again, interesting opportunity there, I think, at the course design level. We've also seen, and this is, I think, a big one for institutions. They open up their institutional report. They see this mountain of accessibility issues with their content. Now, how do we start to think about the content remediation strategy? And so we have seen some cases of institutions, and maybe Brian, from Fresno State, I know that you've done some interesting work in calculating remediation times. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about how you did that, why you thought that was important? It's something that I've brought in here because I think that it is an interesting way to start to understand, your workflows and things like that.
Hey, John, this is Walt.
Hey, Walt.
Yeah, we wanted to track that at the beginning to get a handle on what it would take to do the remediation if we were doing it all ourselves, basically. So we just kind of logged the different files, what the problems were, and then the time it was taking us to rectify those. And of course, there are many files that it just wasn't cost effective to go further with them. We kind of determined that also. That was kind of the reason we started that.
Yeah, so I think And I know I don't know if Jeremy is on the call or not, but I know that Jeremy from Chico State has also been trying to track remediation turnaround times, kind of pre-Ally and post-Ally, so you can really start to see how is Ally impacting how you handle those remediation issues at an institutional level. I think there's also an opportunity to think more. A scanned PDF that's 5 pages, is going to be a different kind of workload than a scan that's 25 pages. And I know actually, Krista, you have brought this up in the user community as well. And so this may be another case where institutions can kind of help in starting to, not just the file type, but also the size of the file, or thinking more about, is it a good scan or a really poor scan? So if we can start to build in some metrics around identifying, the anticipated amount of time to correct an accessibility issue, even if it's not super precise, it starts to give institutions an understanding about, what is the work ahead, and how do we, potentially plan for that. And again, this could be a source of data that feeds into other kinds of inquiries, and that can start to, especially around the instructor feedback piece. And so, one place to start, with instructor feedback is around that accessibility awareness. And so thinking about we've produced a survey, and I talked about it in the first 30 minutes, and some of you may have heard me talking about that. But with that survey, establishing a baseline for instructor attitudes and practices around accessibility, if that at all maps or correlates to their their overall accessibility score in that course. You could also think about it again in terms of disciplines and things like that, if there's various. And this is really about being able to identify instructor needs and support strategies. And so leveraging that survey and again, modifying that survey to fit your university. But if we can keep some of the items consistent, then we can also draw a bit from across institutions and aggregating that data. Another way we can think about the instructor feedback, from this bird's eye view. So again, from kind of drawing from Ally's kind of big data, we can kind of start to explore relationships between, the type of engagement that you see, if it's viewing an issue versus actually fixing the issue, and how that might relate to the type of content item it is. We can hypothesize that instructors are going to grab onto the low-hanging fruit items, like adding alternative text and maybe ignoring more challenging issues. So starting to gather a little bit of a high-level understanding around some of the relationships between the accessibility and type of content, and whether or not instructors are engaging in trying to fix that content will be interesting. And that's really at a high level. But then if we start to drill down again even more, we can start to think and map, survey response data with the actual instructor usage. We've also created a post-Ally survey. So between the awareness survey and the post-Ally survey, you can start to kind of look and see, okay, are instructor attitudes kind of changing, and does that change in attitude also reflect a change in the overall accessibility score? Could think about, again, if we have that course type data and we have this kind of clustering that's happened, how are we kind of mapping, so our STEM instructors are coming in with quite low scores, they need more support. So really leveraging that information as a way to target allocation of resources and support, I think would be another really interesting area to explore. And then from that,
there was a comment in the chat from Krista on that she would love to see a way to evaluate which files are actually being used within the course, and then she's referring to some work that Utah State University has been doing in terms of like building a tool, like an internal tool that can actually help with that. I was wondering if, Christopher, you'd be able to say something very brief about that.
Yeah, just real quick, and then I'll post something in the chat as well. That the big deal is we found is that less than half of the content in our courses is actually currently in use across our courses, and so that Ally I mean, essentially, I mean, initially it was that we're working on eliminating a lot of that, but essentially half of the data is irrelevant to the current student experience. And so, and so we're looking at kind of identifying and getting rid of some of that content, but it's given us a lot of insight. Especially, our hope is that older content is less accessible, and so that as we prune some of that, it'll give us a better perspective on our current content. That tool is, I don't know that it's as, it sounds like Blackboard doesn't need this as much, that it offers some of that already, but in Canvas it's definitely an issue, and we're working on a tool that we can hopefully make available. There's a link to kind of goes over how that works, but yeah, that's a big factor. One of the quick things I'll mention too, real quick, just as a by interruption. Thank you, Krista, for mentioning that. Is some of the things that I think would be really helpful as, and maybe this is a future conversation, but is identifying potentially some kind of building blocks that those of us interested in doing research could do. For example, like one of the challenges as we look at this is like impact on student engagement or student success, whatever that might be. Like that's a whole big problem for us to define kind of how do we even measure student success. And it might be different for different institutions, but perhaps in some areas where we could come together and say, look, here's a common usage or definition that Ally's proposing, or we as a group are proposing, that we could then use in different studies to kind of measure what impact is this or that having on a common definition of student success. Maybe that even exists out there already, I don't know, but some of those kind of building block type of things that would really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. I think that makes a lot of sense, and we are kind of defining some of these metrics and some of these building blocks for the first time, and so it's, I think again it speaks to kind of how exciting of an opportunity it is now that these alternative formats are available to students so readily inside the course experience. And I did try to get a little bit to this, some possible ways to think about or measure some student success in the next couple of items here. I know we're at 11 o'clock. If you have to drop off the call, feel free. Maybe I'll try to push through here another couple minutes, and if there are closing questions or comments, but we can all also dive back into this document and share ideas as well. But again, kind of starting at that high level bird's eye view, thinking about the kinds of formats that are being most commonly downloaded, thinking about the relationship between the original file type and the format that was selected. So we start to see some patterns emerge there? Are there any kind of significant relationships between the accessibility score of the original file and the alternative format usage? So some of that high level insight as a way to start to dive down, potentially into student outcomes. And again, since it's going to be kind of difficult to map out a student's grade with their usage of the alternative formats, given that right now we're stripping away that identifier, we could use surveys to get at some of this. And so thinking about a pre-post strategy, and that student survey gets into a little bit around kind of metacognitive awareness, or what UDL refers to as executive functioning. And so we could take kind of student self-reported usage of alternative formats. So what are they downloading, or if they're downloading them at all, and some of those metrics, and starting to see, do we see, and this is not going to be a causal relation, but are we seeing at least a relationship between course performance metrics like grades or passing a course and alternative format usage? But then I think also, and I think that the UDL community and CAST in particular would be pretty excited to see this type of research, is are we seeing kind of usage of alternative formats and how students may be accessing different formats for different purposes as a way of helping them develop metacognitive awareness or executive functioning. So how am I thinking about my own strategies as a learner, and how am I leveraging different content types or different alternative formats to support that strategy? So that would be a really interesting way to kind of get around, maybe the lack of a student identifier in terms of the grade, but getting a sense of, okay, are the usage patterns, related in some way to some of these student metrics for success? And to Christopher's point, this is, I think, a really great thing to kind of think through in more detail. And then the last one would be, this would be, more longitudinal, but for those of you that are thinking in terms of years, you could try to do a pre-ALLI, post-ALLI intervention in a course that is, consistently offered. So if you're thinking about those intro level courses where you have hundreds of students taking, basically the same course semester to semester, using that as a baseline for then kind of, do you see overall improvement in retention in that course or in student performance pre and post intervention? And so this would really be more experimental design. Again, I think that, thinking broadly about LMS and student success data, it's been a challenge across the research for those of you that have been following mapping LMS usage to specific course outcomes. There's just so much variability in LMS usage and so much variability in kind of what's going on in the background of students' lives. That's been a challenge, but something where you can aggregate longitudinally across, a course that's fairly consistent in structure and delivery, you may be able to start to think a little bit about some direct impact there. And so those are kind of 9 areas that I've highlighted as potential areas for research. Please add comments, questions, ideas to this document. Follow up with me if there's an area that you want to explore, and we can support you in doing that. Or if there's other areas that you think would be worthwhile to take a look at, be happy to do that. So we're 5 minutes over time. If anybody has any questions or comments right now, I haven't been moderating the chat here. Does BB offer a seed grant program to support research? That's something that we could definitely explore, Kelvin, and I also think that we can take a look out there too for possible grants. We would be happy to partner on a potential research grant. Again, I think that this is some really, really exciting kind of opportunities for research here, and so if we keep an eye out for those types of opportunities for some funding to support this research, I know that institutions are strapped to begin with, and taking on a project like this requires some support. And so if we can find those avenues, I think it would be really great, and I would love to support that. Any other questions or ideas as we kind of start to wrap up here?
Just a big thank you. I really do think there's a tremendous opportunity here, especially as we share data with each other, identify schools that are having higher scores than others, perhaps, things like that. There's just really excited for the data that you guys are gathering that could I think really, move the needle on the conversations a lot of organizations are having.
Yes, and Kelvin, maybe we can definitely start to get folks to, put together, who's piloting and who's interested in joining in on and the consortium on a separate Google Doc. So I'll start to organize those things. But yeah, I think as a next step, we can continue to to organize our community a bit, and again start to kind of pick out some of these spots and areas of interest that we may be able to pursue collectively, or again as individual institutions. So we're 7 minutes over. I know everybody's busy. Thank you all. We had a great turnout on the call. Some really, really powerful ideas. Thank you for contributing to the Google document. Nicholas, anything else as we close out?
No, I just wanted to second what you just said. Thanks everyone for participating. And then as we continue to work on the Google Doc and putting ideas together, John, can you say a little bit more about what sort of the next step is going to be in terms of like getting together and continuing to discuss those and actually starting to make some progress?
Yes. So I'll take the information that's being developed in the Google Doc. I think we'll create a new space on the community site that will be research focused, so that we can keep everything in one place, as Krista mentioned. So we'll have a dedicated space there. Institutions can join that space. We'll keep the dialogue going. We've got 10 weeks here of the Allied Community Forum series. We have another virtual office hours planned at the end, which we could commit to another research meeting. So maybe we can start to think about what are some deliverables for that date, or we could pick another date as a group to meet again. But I think let's you know, go ahead and create that space, start to organize our resources a bit. And again, if anybody has a lookout for grant opportunities and things like that, let's start to share and pool them, and then we'll figure out some deliverables or some context for our next meeting. So with that, thank you again so much, all of you, for joining, and we'll be in touch, and hopefully you can attend Christopher's talk next week. I think it will be a really compelling look into accessibility for everyone. All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, John.